Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Gainsight's Chief Strategist of Pulse Programs, Ruben Robigo.
Woo! There's a few of you. Come on up, get a little closer. We're family. We've been with each other for almost 2 days. All of you way in the back. Really excited about this next speaker, continuing on the theme of career success. We have a really interesting challenge in customer success, and Nicolle Paradise, who is the next speaker, will be talking very specifically of why CS organizations are still challenged to get viewed as a growth engine. So with that said, please let me welcome Nicolle Paradise and help me. Give her a hand.
Awesome, thank you.
Woo! You ready?
Of course,
you ready to go?
Man.
All right. So
ready.
you're currently the Senior Director of Customer Experience.
Client experience, that's right.
Yeah, so that'll be cool to hear just a little bit about that.
Sure.
The other really cool thing is you are head of CX for San Francisco TEDx.
That is true, but you will get more than a TED Talk, I promise.
Yeah, and a really cool fact that I just learned about is she has been on all 7 continents. So again, please welcome Nicolle. Go get them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So 6 words. 6 words define why we in customer success struggle to be viewed as a growth engine. And they are these. Don't report the business, impact it. Businesses thrive when there's a balance between storytelling and story doing. Report the business, report the metrics, tell a story, and that's exactly what reporting is. It doesn't impact the business. But now tell why that matters and how you measure its impact, and that's really impacting it. Our challenge in customer success is because we're radically imbalanced. We over-index on kind of the storytelling, and we under-index on our story doing. And so today, I'd like to share a few approaches that get really, really tactical, taken from playbooks of mine for the last 15 years, that we go and we implement back at the office, that we can really understand not just how to talk about this stuff and talk about how we think we can measure impact, but actually bring out plays where we can not only measure growth and figure out whose job is that? Is it mine? Is it yours? And then secondarily, figuring out exactly how do we strike this balance between storytelling and story doing. So first, how do we measure what we don't know? And we think about that in 2 numbers, 67,000 and 52%. So 67,000, any guesses? It's the speed at which we're all moving right now. As we hurl through space and Earth orbits around the sun. And while none of us feel that, it's still true, right? There's no one in this room that would know how to calculate that. And that's fine, because it's not your job, and it's not your job, and it's not your job to understand all of the complex calculations that make that true, but it's still true. However, everyone here is paid to know how to measure how our clients view success and how they view impact. And yet the research tells us that over half of us at this entire campus, plus our industry-wide, have no idea how to start thinking about measuring customer impact or customer ROI. We just don't know how. And so it's difficult to think, how are we supposed to actually impact the customer success if we don't know how to get to their ROI? And so the other part of the research that I have found interesting is if 52% are unclear how they get to customer ROI, that same body are really clear on how to measure churn. We talk about it the last 2 days. What's your churn? What's your burn rate? And so, in other words, we as an industry are very fluent in how we calculate metrics for why clients would leave. We just don't know how to metric or measure why they would stay. And so with that philosophy, I was mentioning that I want to get super, super tactical on how it is that all of us actually start measuring this stuff and stop talking about it. And so, whose job is it to measure it? It starts with our CEO. The research on elite athletes suggests that the highest level of all athletes of all sports have a particular curiosity in common, and that is that they spend about 3 hours a day studying playbooks. Sounds really boring. Except here's the philosophy or the science behind it. The idea that you're studying those plays mean that you go from something that you know how to execute on to something that you really understand to something that becomes intuitive or instinctual. And so, of course, who's responsible for those playbooks? The coach. And in the business world, who's responsible for our playbooks? Our CEOs. Our CEOs are the coach of every company. But here's the challenge. Most CEOs are very clear about how to measure company success. Our playbooks talk about adoption. Our playbooks talk about customer segmentation. Our playbooks don't teach any of us how we actually get to customer value. And so our first call to action for our CEOs is to get very particular about including and maturing our playbooks so that those playbooks can take the leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow and mature them into a place where they know how to measure this stuff. A common misconception, I think, in our industry is around who owns what. Is it company success? Is it customer success? And we hear this a lot. We hear that it's everyone's job. And I'm curious how many of us really, really believe that it's everyone's job? You do? Do you think your CEO believes that it's everyone's job? Yeah. I'm looking at the guy right there. I'd like to think so too. But there's an imbalance between what we say and how we pay. And the reason for that is because typically customer success is measured on growth and churn, measured on do they stay or do they leave. And so the second call to action for our CEOs is if we're serious, if we're actually serious about it being everyone's job, then let's invite our partners in engineering, marketing, IT, human resources, product, to be part of the overall company-wide financial impacts that help measure what is company success and customer success. Now, of course, our CEOs are not the only ones that are responsible for growth. UVPs and directors are responsible for it as well. And we talk a lot about what is the primary objective of customer success, and we say a lot it's to reduce churn. And while I think that's partially fair, I think there's an opportunity here where when we talk about churn, we zoom out, and Nick talked about this yesterday, and really start balancing that outside-in view with the inside-out view. And to put that really tactically, inside out is, I'm the company, here's how I think about my product and service in your ecosystem as the customer. But the outside in says, why did you buy our product? How do I know that it's valuable? And so the first call to action for our VPs and for our directors is to get really, really serious with our leaders of today, and again, with our leaders of tomorrow, in understanding what exactly we mean when we say think like a customer. We know that means outside in, but we're not sure how exactly we measure thinking like a customer. And the opportunity there is to double click into what that means and to how we drive growth. And one of the ways we can is by taking all of the metrics in our ecosystem and classifying them. Are they consumption or are they adoption? This is a playbook that's been super helpful for me over the years. Because when I think about inside-out metrics, I think about things like at previous companies I've been where we measure logins. Logins were supposed to be a predictor of the stickiness of a client inside of a product. But if we think about it through this lens, the client is thinking about how they get value. You see, part of their journey through consumption is just logging in to get to the next point of value. Whereas time inside of the product is really where they're paying for the product or service, right? And so the first playbook is if we separate every single metric in our ecosystem and define, is it consumption or is it adoption, it really starts our leaderships, our VPs, and our directors in separating the people, process, and technologies that tend to focus a little too much on consumption, which is not what our clients are paying us for, and move it over to really value-driven metrics that they can then take back to their CFO and start quantifying what they're paying for. One of the things that I've found fascinating over the last 15 years of doing this, whether I was employee number 5 at a little startup or employee number 58,000 where I am now, is how customers view all products and services. It's that outside-in mentality. They view the strength inside of the product, not outside. And on the surface, this seems sort of, aha, what's the big deal? But this is actually quite controversial for our industry because we spend lots of days talking about be a trusted advisor, be an advocate, be a pal, be a bro. And while there are points to that, the reality is that if we are not focusing as leaders on how our customers measure value, they might not be our customers for very much longer. And the call to action, I guess I would say, that I would think about this is just imagine your favorite customer right now. You've got him or her in mind. Now imagine they're walking into their CFO's office. There's none of this complicated relationship stuff. It's a very simple question. You're in the CFO's office. I pay $200,000 for your product. I've gotten a $300,000 ROI. I'm net positive $100,000. Cool. I'd love to renew. The conversation differently happens. I pay $200,000 for your product. I don't know the value. Well, I don't know the value, but they're nice and they help me. And when stuff breaks, they are my trusted advisor. No, okay, so 200,000, I don't know how they get value. I don't know, but I really need them. Now, while that sounds a little hyperbolic, that's exactly the conversation we're asking our customers to have when we're not doing the hard work of measuring these ROIs. And so while I find a ton of value in advocacy and in being a trusted advisor, I think the theme that we're starting to hear yesterday and today, particularly from Nick and team, is we've got to get a little bit more serious about how we measure growth and how we measure impact. And that's not just from being a partner. So the call to action for our VPs and directors is to really help, as we've said before, our future leaders think about what it means to be a trusted advisor. And whether we're talking about the ROI playbooks from the CEO section, if we're talking about how we separate consumption and adoption, or if we're talking about how we think like a customer, giving the tools and training folks to replace you, to take your job when you get promoted, is the number one call to action that we can do to measure growth, because we're bringing all of the knowledge base up for folks to understand how they think like a customer and how they themselves are measured. And then lastly, the call to action for our VPs and our directors is to sum all of this up into what I like to call the 52% opportunity. We said at the beginning that 52% of us know how to measure why our customers leave. We have no idea why they stay. And the real call to action is figuring out how, in all of your experience, you start writing this stuff down so that the CSMs are less inclined to try and figure out what this stuff means and allow them to really be able to measure it. Because if you can measure it, you can improve it. Now, of course, our leaders are not the only ones who are responsible for measuring growth. It is the job of our CSMs as well. And I have been in that role and been in that position where I'm thinking, this all sounds really strategic and nice, but what do? I don't have access to the data. I don't have access to a lot of things. And so a few playbooks that I'd like to share with our CSMs in the room is a few simple questions about how you can start impacting growth today. And one of them is a very simple question. How might I measure this before I message this? The power in this comes from the sort of work that we do as CSMs. For example, on a client call, that client call might be, I looked at your account, I see you haven't been using the product in a while, and I just want to be helpful and call and see how things are. And while that speaks to the advocacy, if we were to look at it through this frame of how might I measure this before I message this, that conversation might look like this. Well, I reviewed your account, And I found that you could be saving 8 hours a week by using this particular feature or this new feature. Now, while this is directionally correct and each of your products will be different, it's the spirit of the law. And it's the idea that rather than just asking to report the business, we have an opportunity to impact it. And part of impacting it is finding some value when we get on the phone. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not interested in value just being ethereal, right? We have to know how to actually take action. And these are some of the plays that I found to be really helpful. But those are also important that we do not only for our customers, but for our internal customers. And so think about the last status meeting you were in. You probably had a conversation with your internal teams that said something like, well, customer X, they are enterprise level, but they buy per license, and that sucks. And then that's kind of the end of the conversation. And again, I've been there. So if I were to see this through the lens of how might I measure this before I message this, there's an opportunity there to expand that, to say something like, well, enterprise level pricing would actually yield this much more in revenue. So a specific example, I work for ADP, 58,000 employees, 700,000 customers. And there is a loving company here in Silicon Valley that categorizes us as an SMB. I'm $14.2 billion. How am I a small business? But the way that they think about it is, here's what I've sold. You only bought 100 licenses, and so we're going to treat you as if you're a small business. The opportunity for our CSMs from this playbook is, if I were running that account, I'd think, okay, 58,000 minus 100, carry the one, okay, 47,900. So I would look at my enterprise level pricing, 47,900 licenses times my pricing, and while again, it's only directionally correct, I now can go to that status meeting not just saying we have a problem with our enterprise accounts, but rather actually do the math that says, here's how we could impact it, and furthermore, here's the sum of the money that we might be leaving on the table. So these are just a few examples of how we can think about actually taking action on being part of the solution and actually impacting it and not just reporting it. One of my other favorite plays is what I call the so what. This is one of my Paradise playbook favorites. And for those of you who've listened to Allison's podcast, of course, Allison, the CCO of Gainsight, this will sound familiar to you. But I was her third guest when she launched the podcast, and I went on a whole tangent about the so what philosophy. And my concept was this. We all sit in meetings, and we look at stuff like this. This is what I do all the day long. I get into a meeting, and I see this chart, and I think, okay, I don't know what you want me to know, so I'm going to look at, there's customer segmentation. I know I have a risk. It's mapped to NPS. I've got trailing 12-month revenue. Something's happening, and there are different colors, and it's swoopy. And so it takes me a minute to figure out, what do you want me to know? What am I supposed to decide? Whether it's this view, whether it's a health view. It's tough to impact change immediately when folks are still trying to catch up to what the heck we're saying. So the opportunity here is a very literal so what column. And in most of my decks, I have an actual so what that looks just like this. And the opportunity here, and really the call to action for our CSMs, is to be thinking, okay, how could I measure this before I message this? So if you're staring at all this data, your first column would say something like, okay, here's the key insight that I want you to know. Enterprise clients, they take 60 days to onboard. SMB takes 30. That's still kind of a so what, that's reporting the business. Here's how I measured it. We have a 22% higher churn rate in enterprise. Okay, now you have my attention. So I just took all of this data. I don't have to have a massive database to be able to know my own customers and my own product and know that that's a risk. And then we add another play, which is, what's your recommendation? You're in the room for a reason, and whether someone's an intern or someone's the CEO, you've got a seat at the table. So be really thoughtful. What do you recommend and why? And then let's carry that so what through. Impacting change is also saying, what could go sideways? So put in, what are the impacts? What's something that could go awry from the obstacles? And then lastly, the call to action that you have for them would be, what decision do you need made in that meeting to maintain forward progress? And I don't mean circle back and connect and something's in the hopper and we're going to talk in a week. I mean, be really prescriptive. What do you need done in that meeting? That sort of change agent mentality doesn't require a fancy title. It just requires thinking about the space that we own and thinking, how can I measure this stuff? And those small plays from a playbook absolutely position a CSM to impact growth. Because again, it stops being just about reporting the business and starts being a lot about impacting it. We said at the beginning that there's this balance, right? Part of why we struggle to be a growth engine is because we're so out of balance. Nick, the CEO of Gainsight, I don't even know, it's like Madonna, I don't know why I have to say who he is. He was recently interviewed by Influitive, and he had some interesting thoughts on this. He was quoting Albert Einstein, and he said that not everything that counts has to be counted. He went on to say that not every item needs to be tied directly to a sale. And so what I think Nick is balancing here for all of us is that there is this need to have balance between how much we over-report, but we also don't want to overcorrect and just try and measure everything because then we might not do anything. And so that returns us to our theory around how we balance storytelling with story doing. Storytelling is defined as an account of connected events. These are my definitions from my playbook, by the way. If you Google story doing, it comes up as a different philosophy. But I fundamentally believe that this difference comes from not only telling what's happening with the connected events, but then saying why they matter and how you measure them. There does need to be this balance because, like Nick said, you can't count everything, but we have to be able to count some stuff. And so in the spirit of storytelling and story doing, we start first with storytelling. When you all signed up for Pulse, you saw this on the website, and there's just this big arrow that said, you're going to get more than a TED Talk. And as Ruben mentioned, I have the privilege of being the head of client experience for TEDx here in San Francisco. And there is a lot of valuable data that comes from storytelling and how it's applicable to business. And one of the things that we talk about with our TED speakers is coaching them around what's the center of your story. Lots of folks think the center of the story is their data, or they think the center of the story is themselves. But whether it's customer success or TEDx, the center of the story has to be our audience, has to be our customers. Sounds pretty logical, except that often it's not, because we tend to put the company at the center of the story instead of the customer. So when we're out of balance, there are very real consequences. So rather than share a story about when I was awesome and what went really well, I thought it'd be more appropriate to share a story about failure. So failure is not just in my hair and whatever was happening at this point in my life. I was shortly out of college. I had my first real big boy job. I was running sales. And shortly after this picture was taken, I was fired. No job, no money, no plan, and no idea why I had been fired. At the time, I was doing exactly what I was told. I was being a trusted advisor. I was being a partner. I was advocating. The punchline is that I was putting the company at the center of every story with my customers. I wasn't putting the customers at the center of the story. Didn't get a lot of sales, got fired, and got fired for all of the right reasons. And so the thing that we learn is that when we're not serious about putting our customers and the way that they think about value at the center, we're going to get it wrong. And the data supports that. The data tells us that of all of the customers we have, about 4% will tell us when they're unhappy, which leaves the rest not saying much at all. Plus or minus, we think that about 96% will simply be dissatisfied and go away. And of the customers that self-elect to leave, 91% essentially say that they wouldn't come back. And so why this matters is because we're not going to get a lot of data from our customers. We're just not. We can ask them a bunch of things, but the reality is we might not know what we're doing well, and we might not know what's going poorly. So we might lose a customer, we might lose a job. And the call to action here for all of us then is to really think about, how do I balance listening to my customer and still delivering value? How do I get to the heart of doing the heavy lifting for them? If we think about that CFO analogy again, we really want to be the sort of people that's doing the heavy lifting for our customers. Because in the absence of doing the work for them, we just sort of hope that they know. Hope is not a strategy, and it's not profitable. So our opportunity is to do that heavy lifting and to measure for them. One of the other challenges that I think we face in customer success towards growth is understanding how we get even more tactical. I've listened to hundreds of these sessions, and while I find a lot of them interesting, I find very few of them actionable. And so my commitment to each of you when we started was getting very specific about playbooks, very specific calls to action that we can go back and do. And one of my favorites from my playbook is about customer conversations. This is a template that, whether it's pre-sales, whether it's a QBR, a steering committee meeting, wherever it is in the process, I send this template to the customer and ask them to fill it out. And it looks something like this. In the customer's voice, what is it that you want to achieve? So I, as the customer, would write out, well, here's what I want to achieve, just in general. Now, I can't, because I have all of these obstacles. If I could, then I would be able to achieve this short-term goal, and this is how I would measure it. And then with that done, this would be my long-term goal, and this is how I would measure that. So while that sounds really academic, let's see what customers have to say about this through the lens of measuring growth and getting to our customer ROI. So here's what a customer says. Okay, I got to fill this thing out. Well, I want a health score. I want to understand how my 700 clients are experiencing us, and I want to understand the risks. Okay, we're on to something. Why can't you? Well, I can't. Remember, I'm the client. I know this stuff. Customer success doesn't. The client does. So the customer says, well, I can't because I don't have the data centralized, and I have a whole team that's spending about 200 hours a week in emails and databases and Excel to get me that information. But if I could, and when I can, it means that I'll be able to take about 190 hours and put that towards non-operational stuff, towards client-facing stuff. This is all from the customer. Great. So how you'd measure it then? You'd reduce it from 200 hours to 10 hours. I would have never known to ask this, but that's why they're giving you their voice and how they measure it. And then with that long-term goal achieved, awesome. Then, now that I've got that extra 190 hours, I can start understanding, why are my customers at risk? And furthermore, I don't even know why they're healthy. So I could spend 190 hours figuring out, why are they healthy? How do I scale that? How do I fix the at-risk customers? And then I'm going to measure that by finally launching that customer listening tour. You see, I don't need access to a big database. I don't need to know a bunch of hard math. But this is my QBR. This is my steering committee meeting. This is my success play. And this comes right from our customers. I said earlier that it's really important that we also take that same philosophy and put it towards our company conversations. So in that same spirit, company conversations, where we're not only evangelizing why we're valuable, but we're actually measuring it. One of the tools that I prefer is a Six Sigma process called the 5 Whys, and some of you might be using it at your company. It gets to the root cause of why things happen, or at least gets us a little bit more directionally correct. So a typical problem statement in a customer success meeting I'm in goes like this. We have a churn issue in our enterprise accounts. Someone says, why? Well, sales sucks. Okay, well, they oversell, and onboarding should take They're saying it takes 10 days, and I know it takes 45 days. So what's the root cause? Well, because they suck and they don't have a clue. And then we go back to whatever we were doing. There's the root cause analysis. That's reporting the business. That's a cool, fun bumper sticker. But it's not impacting it. So the 5 whys gets to the root, or at least starts to get to the root of why this happens. So let's reimagine that conversation. Ugh, we have a churn issue. Why? Well, because sales is promising it'll take 10 days and it takes 45. Why are they promising that? Well, okay. They're under the gun. They have a lot to sell, and enterprise is a focus for them, so that they'll just say anything to close a deal. Why is it a focus for them? Well, we didn't have an enterprise product last year, and so they need to kind of go sell it. We only sold into SMB last year. Why did you not have an enterprise product last year? Okay, well, we don't actually have an enterprise product now, so we have an SMB product that we scale to be enterprise, and, well, it takes a long time. SMB was 10 days, and now it takes 45 days. Okay, because you're trying to work inside of big companies. So what? Why are they telling people that it takes 45 days, or why does it take 45 days? Well, because the functionality, once you hit 1,000 users, the automation just breaks. Okay, that sucks. And we just went from the bumper sticker of what wasn't going well to actually getting to the 5th why, which is it perfect? Of course not. Is it a tool? Is it a playbook to get us a little bit closer to what that root cause might be? That's the power of the 5 whys. And we do this at ADP. I wouldn't say every meeting, but it feels like nearly every meeting. And that's because we're not content to just have a bumper sticker. We want to get to the heart of what's happening, and we want to do so quickly. And these sorts of plays from a playbook stop being really cool academic ideas and start being ways that we can actually go back to our offices and affect change. Because the really, really boring truth is that you can't summarize growth on a bumper sticker. You just can't. I want to. We all have the attention span of nil. But the reality is, if we're going to be serious about being not only divisions that impact change, but actually being taken serious as growth engines, we do have to be a bit more thinking like a customer. And as we've defined, thinking like a customer is imagining our customer in the office of the CFO. And when we apply the aggregate of all of these changes, there are very real-world benefits that come from it. So a case study comes from my own company. Inside of the massive juggernaut that is ADP, we work inside of global money movement and compliance. So we're responsible for all the funds that ADP moves, $2 trillion. When you're a 70-year-old company, you're used to an evolution. Stuff is changing at a glacial pace. So about a year and a half ago, a whole bunch of us started a revolution, not an evolution. And by leveraging some very simple plays that I've shared today, no one was asked to go spin up anything particularly complex. We were just asked to measure it. Here are some very real results. One, from the business side. We've decreased our external fees by 15%. When you're a $14 billion company, that adds up. When you're a $2 million startup, that adds up. We were then able to reinvest those savings back into the people, into the process, into the technologies, so that we could be not only a leader in compliance, but also just work on initiatives that were more interesting to us. Those are the business results, but we have to impact the customer. So customer results reduced calls by 20%. When you have 700,000 customers around the globe, that matters. When you're a startup and you have 100 customers, that also matters. The other benefit is because customers are calling in less, they're happier. Not rocket science. So we're watching our NPS scores go up because they're happier, which is a loyalty metric. We're also seeing sales go up. And now, of course, how does it impact our employees? Well, our employee, year over year, the employee engagement score has gone up 2%. That might not sound like a shocking number, but Recall I said there are 58,000 of us. And so the exciting news here is whether I've done this at a 100-person company or a 58,000-person company, it works. 15% is 15%. And it's really exciting to think about how when we get back to basics and just start thinking like a customer and actually know what that means, we can have very real, impactful results. And that comes from understanding not only how we measure this stuff and that it's everyone's job, but it also comes from balancing that storytelling of connecting events to story doing, which is measuring the stuff. Ultimately, if we want to be the change agents that we say we want to be in customer success, then there's only really one way that we're going to get there, at least prescriptively, and that's to lessen how much we report the business and be a lot more strategic about how we impact it. And of all of the data and of everything that we've talked about today, if you were to just go back to your office and remember only one thing, I would just ask you to ask yourself, how might I measure this before I message this? Because that is the catalyst for growth. Thank you. Ruben said at the beginning we'd have a little bit of time for questions, and I think there's been some Slido magic happening during our session. So we have about 6-7 minutes if there's anything that I can be helpful with. Okay, we've got a couple questions. What's the singular message you give to an exec when all they want is revenue? That's a great question. I would zoom out for a moment and remember how we said that the center of the story is the audience. So when I'm talking to an exec who's my CRO, that's the language. So I take all of that data and my so what becomes through the language of the CRO. That's going to be very different than all of that data in the language of IT or marketing. So that's sort of a broad question to say that I'm not sure that there's a specifically pat answer, but we do have to remember who our audience is. And secondarily, I know this stuff is difficult because we think, it always comes back to the money. But the reality is, even when you work for a nonprofit, people have to get paid. And so while I'm not a fan of constantly bringing everything back to finances, I think there is an opportunity to remember businesses exist to be viable. And viable is a really cool word for make money. So I think that there's a way to return to what Nick has been talking about. I think there's a way to return to the human experience and make people and authenticity a part of the story. But if we forget that we're there to talk about revenue and make money, then we're kind of missing the point of how we get paid and how everyone else gets paid. Should CS report to the CRO? In a vacuum of a perfect world, I see farming and hunting. I see hunting as net new logos, and that's the CRO. I see farming as retaining the logos that we already have, and that's the CCO. Bain, the consulting firm, says that it costs about 7 times more to go get a new logo or go hunting than it does to retain one. And so if there is not a CCO, would I say a CRO? Sure, customers are paying. But ideally, I'd love to see a world where we're not questioning, should marketing report to IT? Should IT report to product? And part of what we're talking about today is we're still not completely taken seriously as an industry. The more we measure, the more we'll stop being asked which department that's not us should we report to. The short answer is if there's not a CCO, sure, it's still a customer. The better answer is, as we mature our industry, we'll have CCOs. ADP is huge. How will your results be adopted by the other BUs? Great question. It's huge and it's siloed. We often function as if we are very different businesses. And so while that can be frustrating, I see it as an opportunity. I, at my core, am a revolutionist, not an evolutionist. And I joined ADP a year and a half ago, prior having been at a fintech startup here in Silicon Valley as their head of customer success. And one of the things that I wanted to do was start a revolution. Will it be adopted? Yes. Am I a revolutionist inside of an evolutionist company? Yes. And the way that I think about this is framed in what I call organ rejection. If we shove a whole bunch of change into an environment that we know we're right and we know they're wrong, that body of the company simply can't handle it, and you're going to have organ rejection. So I often ask myself, do I want to be right or do I want to win? I want to win. And so the revolutionist in me has to calm down a little bit and be thoughtful and roll these techniques that we've talked about out slowly. But like you saw, when you're $14 billion and you're saving 15% in fees, something is happening. It will be adopted at scale and over time. We just have to be patient because I am not the center of the story. In this analogy, ADP would be. So Nicolle has to be patient so that ADP can be the center of the story. Why does CS have to be a revenue generating org? It's a good question. I'm answering it with a non-answer for a moment. It's interesting how ultimately CS is about retaining our customers and sales is about net new customers. And at the risk of sounding really abrasive, we've just spent the last 45 minutes having an entire session in a massive hall about why we're still proving what we're worth. We have to right now constantly justify, do we pay CSMs on commission? Do we not? Who do we report into? Because we're not mature yet as an organization. We're getting there, and this year, this is my 4th year at Pulse, we're more mature than ever, so that's exciting. But the reality is that until we can stand on our own and actually prove why Bain says it's 7 times more expensive to go get a new logo than to retain one, we're going to keep justifying it. And so the opportunity will be, we're going to be lumped in with sales until we can prove a unique value. And some of the tools that we've talked about today of how we actually measure existing growth within our own organization is how we're going to get there. Is CX part of CS or is CS part of CX? So I'm both. At a Gainsight conference, I have a different view than our industry. I believe in the formula that is promoted, right? That customer outcomes and customer experience equal customer success. But I don't agree. And that's because academically, the discipline of customer experience is around not just how we measure post-sale and adoption, and while that stuff is valuable, my job is to measure every single experience from pre-purchase to renewal and how you feel when you see the ADP logo. And so the technical answer is, sure, we are one and the same, but the Nicolle answer is that they're very different and have very different purposes inside the client journey. And to ask that question is to be inside out. It's to be the company perspective. But if we think about it through the customer perspective, the customer is saying, okay, I need someone to figure out how I get onboarded, drive adoption, get me time to value, help me have this conversation with the CFO, and that's quite valuable. Customer experience is just doing something different inside of the customer journey, but it's really about the customer and measuring their experience, not our titles. I think we have time for one more question. I'm in no particular order, apparently. In a perfect world, who gets paid more, sales or CSMs? Yeah, I know I sound like such an academic here. Who gets paid more? Well, who has more risk? We go back to how do businesses make money? There's a great podcast that talks about what exactly does a CEO do all day, because people think, God, you get paid so much money. What do you actually do? CEOs are paid by how much risk they assume. The more risk you assume, the more money you make. That's just how it works. And so sales is out there hunting for new logos, and it's a lot more risky, quite candidly, than it is trying to retain our customers. I'm not saying it's easy or hard, I'm just saying it's more risky. And our base salaries are typically going to be higher than a salesperson's base salary. Their commissions will be higher. So who do I think nets more when they do their taxes equal? Who gets paid more? I don't even think that's the right question. I think it's about understanding who's assuming risk and why they get paid what they paid. Let me see if I can get a very quick one. Does ADP have any measures for customer ROI in addition to what CSM has asked customers? We do. This would be longer than I have time for, but on that podcast that I referenced earlier that I was with Allison on a few years ago, we have our own independent system, and the punchline is we have a system that we use in addition to all the metrics you think about that's effortless quality index. And it's a very specific measurement to understand what is your process and how many failure points or win points do you have inside of every single journey. And then we measure that at a very specific and proprietary way that helps us understand not just what you know is frustrating, but what are all the friction points that you don't even know that you're having failures for because you haven't caught on that you're failing or that you're succeeding, but we do. So there are a number of metrics for that. And with that, we are out of time. So I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the time. And we'll invite Ruben back to the stage to greet us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicolle. Fantastic. All right. I'm going to